My name is Hannah. I'm 32 years old. For a long time, my life revolved around work, responsibilities, and routine chores. As a student, I spent endless hours in the library, swallowing pages of books, as if looking for answers to questions that I didn't even have time to ask. When I started my career, I was drowned in a sea of documents, calls, and deadlines. My life became a series of gray days, where the main goal was to finish everything on time and finally go to bed. I didn't leave much time for myself. One day, one of my friends, a real sincere soul, noticing my seclusion, gently pushed me to reconsider my priorities. "Hannah, you have to allow yourself some happiness, you know? Life is not just about work," she said, smiling. She organized a group blind date, which, to be honest, I attended with great skepticism. That's where I met Michael. At the time, he was a rookie working in a building near my office. His eyes shone with genuine interest, and although I was nervous, his kind words gradually dispelled my tension. He spoke simply, but in a way that made me want to listen to him endlessly. We became closer, gradually opening our hearts to each other. His caring attitude made me feel that I could be more than just a busy career woman. A year later, we decided to get married. It seemed that my life had finally turned in a different direction, as if fate had unfolded a new, amazing path in front of me. Even my friend, who organized our first meeting, was discouraged by this news. "Seriously, Hannah? Are you getting married? This is amazing!" she exclaimed, and I smiled, sincerely grateful for the day when she literally pushed me out of my shell. Our families reacted to this news in different ways. When my parents saw me happy, they were happy to welcome Michael into our circle. But it wasn't so smooth on his part. Michael's mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. How to describe them without resorting to heavy words? They did not hide their displeasure. "I'm a little shocked that you criticize my mother-in-law. If you don't work, why don't you leave here?" My sister-in-law threw it in my face when I once tried to raise the topic of family responsibilities. Ever since I took over his mother's debt, they've been throwing words at me like sharp arrows, without the slightest sense of gratitude. Yes, I understood that to some extent this is their way of protecting their little world, but the day I started packing my things, they suddenly realized that I wasn't going to play by their rules. They understood and, it seems, for the first time put their heads together to decide what to do next. It was difficult for me to cope with their coldness. But deep down, I knew that Michael's love was my compass. She led me through the storm. My life with Michael seemed to me like a bright island in a raging sea. He was not just a husband for me, he became my support, a man who knew how to see more in me than I did myself. And although the trials were not long in coming, I felt that we were able to overcome them together. But the reality of family life turned out to be far from the dreams I dreamed of. My mother-in-law, a woman with a sharp mind and an equally sharp tongue, seemed to be trying her best to put me in my place. Her sister-in-law, her ally, did not hide her contempt. They looked at me as if I was someone else, an outsider in their family. "You're trying so hard to look better than all of us, but don't forget who's in charge here," my mother-in-law once said. Her voice was cold, like icy water spilled on her head. I was silent. I didn't want to start a war, but everything was shrinking inside. I tried to keep the peace for Michael's sake. He saw my efforts and comforted me as best he could. But when I took on his mother's debt, deciding to help the family, the situation only escalated. They didn't thank me, but rather seemed to take it for granted. My attempts to establish relations with them were met with a blank wall. "Yes, I understand," I said to myself when another attempt to find a common language ended in failure. "But from now on, it's up to you guys." I decided that I would no longer bend under their pressure. The day I started packing my things, their faces were filled with incomprehension. They realized that I might not be going to put up with this anymore. Their conversations behind closed doors, whispers, glances, All this indicated that they began to realize that they could lose me. But I was firm. I knew I had to protect myself and my borders, even if it caused a storm. After all, love is not only happiness, but also a struggle to keep yourself in this equation. My friend, the one who introduced me to Michael, once said, "Hannah, I can see how hard you're trying. But remember, you don't have to sacrifice yourself for someone else's recognition." These words became a support for me, which was so lacking. At that moment, I realized that the future of my family depends not only on my love for Michael, but also on my ability to defend my place in this complex world, where the struggle for respect is sometimes stronger than any feelings. "Hannah, you haven't told me about your boyfriend in a long time," Mom said, putting down her cup of tea and looking at me with slight concern. "So I was a little worried that maybe you weren't going to get married." Her words took me by surprise. I hardly told my parents about Michael, not because I was hiding him, but rather because of my inner fear that our happiness was still too fragile to share. But now, hearing her voice full of tenderness and anxiety, I realized that my parents, even if they don't say it out loud, think a lot about me. "Michael, please take care of her," Dad added, referring to Michael, who was next to me that evening. These words remained in my heart like a warm trace. I suddenly felt how much my parents wanted to see me happy. They rarely expressed their feelings directly, but their quiet, unobtrusive desire to see their daughter married, supported and loved, filled me with gratitude. My heart warmed up, as if a small flame had ignited inside. When I first visited Michael's house, I was full of mixed feelings. On the one hand, I was filled with curiosity and joy that he wanted to introduce me to his family. On the other hand, I felt nervous excitement, afraid of not living up to expectations. His parents greeted me with a warm smile. His mother, gentle and caring, made me feel safe almost immediately. And my father, a man with a deep voice and kind eyes, kept up the conversation so easily that the tension in my shoulders gradually disappeared. Then it was time for dinner. It was an evening that I was mentally preparing for, but I was still a little nervous, especially knowing that his younger sister, Melissa, would be there. She was only 25, but her bluntness and sometimes sharpness in her statements made me feel vulnerable. "Hannah, you're over 30 now. Aren't you getting married too late?" "What is it?" she asked, looking at me as if I were a schoolgirl who hadn't learned her lesson. I froze. The rudeness of her words pricked me like a needle, and I didn't immediately find what to say. But Michael quickly intervened, ending the awkward pause with his calm and confident remark. "Melissa, everyone has their own way, and I'm glad that Hannah and I got together at the right time." His support was my salvation, and despite the stressful start, dinner went well. We discussed our wedding plans, shared our dreams, and told each other life stories. It helped me feel like I was part of their world. The wedding was fabulous. We chose a cozy place surrounded by greenery, invited a lot of friends and relatives. This day was full of joy, laughter, and love. When Michael held my hand and said the vows, I felt like I was in the middle of a miracle. Our honeymoon was a continuation of this happiness, full of travel, funny moments, and long conversations until the morning. But life doesn't always follow a bright scenario. After 2 years of our happy life, filled with quiet joys, evening walks, movies, shared breakfasts, we received tragic news. Michael's father, the man who always received me with kindness and warmth, has passed away. We knew that his health was failing him, but no one expected it to happen so suddenly. This loss came as a shock to the whole family. Michael was depressed, but he tried to hold on for the sake of his mother and sister. I saw how pain and the need to be strong for others were fighting in him. His mother had withdrawn into herself, and Melissa, despite her usual bluntness, seemed confused, as if she had lost the foundation of her world. My mother-in-law's grief, quiet but all-consuming, was reflected in her every movement, in every look. She seemed broken, but she still held on, as if she was trying to save face in front of us. Her loss seemed to be more than just the death of her husband. Deep anxiety flickered in her eyes, and soon we found out the reason: a huge debt that she got into by trusting some unscrupulous person. She lost a significant amount of money and her world collapsed overnight. When Michael and I found out about this, our emotions alternated with lightning speed, from amazement to confusion, from pity to anxiety. "We have to help," Michael said softly but firmly, looking at me. His eyes, usually full of warmth, now shone with determination. We decided to use some of our savings to help our mother-in-law, realizing that she should not cope with this burden alone. After the loss of her husband, the debt seemed to her an insurmountable mountain. We knew that this decision could affect our plans for the future, but there was no doubt, family comes first. But my mother-in-law's reaction was unexpected. Instead of thanking her, she asked with a smile, "If I have problems again, can I count on Michael?" Michael frowned. His gentle nature rarely allowed him to express dissatisfaction, but at this moment I felt that his patience was being tested. "We'll always help, Mom," he replied, although there was a note of concern in his voice. "But please try to avoid such situations." Of course," she replied hastily, but her gaze slipped away. "I'll find a way. Maybe make more money." There was an ambiguity in her words that bothered us. "Is this not gambling?" Michael asked cautiously. She just waved it off, but tension settled in our family. We began to monitor her actions, trying to be inconspicuous. We didn't want to offend her, but we couldn't let the disaster happen again. In the midst of these events, Michael was injured. The incident was ridiculous and mundane. I slipped on the stairs in the office, but the consequences turned out to be more serious than expected. He ended up in the hospital, and this was another test for us. I woke up earlier than usual every morning so I could visit him before work. Then she hurried to the office, after which she returned to the hospital to be with him. These days were exhausting, but I held on for him. The mother-in-law, however, showed little interest. Her life went on as usual, and I didn't notice any changes in her routine. This raised questions for me, but I tried not to jump to conclusions. After Michael's discharge, we decided to visit her. It was our first visit in a long time. When we entered the house, the atmosphere seemed a little different to me. She was strangely tense, but at the same time imbued with a strange lightness. My mother-in-law looked happy, even too happy. "Michael, you're getting better, you can run again," she said with a smile, as if all those difficult events that surrounded us had not happened. We all smiled, and at that moment, as if on a sudden impulse, Michael reached for her bankbook, which was lying on the edge of the table. "Mom, can I take a look?" "What is it?" he asked calmly, but I could see his fingers clenching harder than usual. She froze for a moment, but then answered with the same kind smile. "Of course, son, take it. Everything is fine there." The money my husband and I had saved up as a safety cushion for my mother-in-law to ease her future has almost completely disappeared. Michael flipped through the pages of the bankbook in disbelief, while I watched him with bated breath. "What's wrong with this bankbook?" he asked in surprise, without taking his eyes off the numbers. The mother-in-law, who was sitting opposite us, looked away at first, but then looked at us with a slight embarrassment, and a bitter smile appeared on her face. "You know," she began, pretending that it was nothing at all, "I was having tea with my friends and came across such a pretty purse. Well, you know, these things happen once in a lifetime." And then, somehow, everything turned around. She stopped talking and laughed nervously, but this laughter only increased our shock. Michael and I froze, as if we had been doused with cold water. She spent the money that we had saved so hard, without even thinking about how much it might affect her future. "Mom," Michael said, bracing himself, but his voice was shaking. "You don't have to do that. You know how much we have invested our strength and hearts to give you this money so that you can live in peace without worrying." His words didn't sound like a rebuke, but rather like a desperate attempt to reach her. My mother-in-law looked remorseful, but this did not lessen our concern for her future. We understood that leaving her alone, allowing her to manage her finances again without our control, would be too risky. That's when we got the idea. We offered my mother-in-law to move in with us. It was not an easy decision, but it seemed to be the only way to ensure her safety and stability. When we brought up this topic, her eyes suddenly shone, and a sincere joy appeared on her face. "Do you really want me to live with you?" "What is it?" she asked in surprise, as if she couldn't believe her ears. "Of course, Mom," Michael replied. And so she left her house and moved into our apartment. That's how our new life together began. At first, my husband and I were worried about how she was adapting, but her mood seemed to improve every day. She seemed even happier than we expected. The mother-in-law enjoyed spending time at family dinners. We laughed, talked, and shared stories. She sometimes took it upon herself to help with household chores, which pleasantly surprised us. Her participation was an unexpected relief for both of us, and gradually our lives began to play with new colors. One day at dinner I asked her, "Mom, what would you like for lunch today?" She thought about it, and then offered with a smile, "You know, I think I'll invite you." "What do you think?" Michael and I laughed in response. Her mood became more and more upbeat, and this pleased us. Due to the fact that I worked remotely, I had the opportunity to keep track of her expenses. Michael took over the management of her bank account to prevent any unforeseen situations. We still worried from time to time about her tendency to make impulsive decisions, but the days went on as usual. Our worries gradually faded into the background, giving way to new, more vivid memories. Mother-in-law became a part of our daily lives, and it seemed that everything was moving in the right direction. However, despite the bright moments, we continued to keep our finger on the pulse, fearing new surprises. 6 months have passed. Life flowed smoothly, and my mother-in-law seemed to enjoy every day in our house. That day, Michael and I were relaxing in the living room, talking about little things. Suddenly, the intercom sounded. Michael looked at me questioningly, and I got up and went to the device. "Who is this?" I asked, pressing the button. A familiar figure appeared on the screen. "This is Melissa," I heard my sister-in-law say. Her unexpected appearance took me by surprise. "Melissa, it's been a long time," I said, hiding my surprise. "Mom's here." Her next question made me even more tense. "Of course I know. Is she happy here?" She sounded like she was going to charge me. I tried to ignore it by opening the door and inviting her in. "Mom, look who's here," I said, leading Melissa into the living room. The mother-in-law looked up from her knitting and, seeing her daughter, smiled happily. "Oh, Melissa, I haven't seen you for a long time. What brings you here?" "I just wanted to see you." "From time to time, you need to check how you live," Melissa replied with a slight smile. The conversation was calm, but there was tension in the air. Melissa suggested that her mother-in-law go to lunch together. Michael and I decided to stay at home to give them some time alone. They left, and we spent over an hour discussing how Melissa had suddenly appeared and what could have brought her. When they returned in the evening, something in their faces had changed. Melissa looked sullen, and my mother-in-law, who had seemed animated before, now looked at me strangely, as if she did not know whether to say something directly. And suddenly Melissa said, "Hannah, you're torturing my mother, aren't you?" Those words hit me like lightning. I froze, not understanding what she meant. My mother-in-law looked at me sternly, but said nothing. "What are you talking about, Melissa?" Michael asked, getting up and moving closer to his sister. "Hannah would never do that." His voice sounded firm, and I felt relieved that he immediately sided with me. But Melissa didn't back down. "Michael, you trust her too much." Mom says she can't go outside. She hears Hannah saying strange things in the house. I looked at her in shock. Michael frowned and then turned to his mother. Mom, is this true? What is it? He asked, but she only looked down. Melissa continued, her voice gaining confidence. There were times when Mom asked you to go shopping, and you refused, saying that it was a waste of money. Mom also claims that Hannah is taking her money. These words stunned me. I couldn't believe my mother-in-law would think such a thing. It was all like an obsession. Michael tried to explain. Melissa, that's not true. We really monitor Mom's expenses to protect her from unnecessary expenses. Hannah does everything to make her mother live in comfort. But Melissa didn't seem to be listening. She only coldly stated, I want you to leave our house, Hannah. I don't think my mother can live happily with you. These words touched me to the core. I didn't know how to react. Everything I did, every day of caring, every dinner, every conversation, was now perceived as something sinister. I turned to my mother-in-law, hoping to see support in her eyes, or at least doubt in my daughter's words. But she remained silent, her gaze was stern, and her lips were pursed. Michael couldn't help himself. Melissa, this is too much. Hannah is my wife, and she does everything she can for Mom. You can't come here and make such accusations. But I felt that this conversation was just beginning and that there was something more behind Melissa's words and her mother-in-law's silence. Melissa straightened up, crossed her arms over her chest, and looked at Michael defiantly. You're too protective of her, Michael. You just don't see what she's doing to Mom, she said with a note of indignation. My heart was thudding, but I tried to stay calm. The accusations coming out of her mouth were so unfair that I couldn't believe it was happening in reality. Melissa, I said softly, trying not to get emotional. I do not know what your mother told you, but all Michael and I do is try to take care of her. If Mom feels unhappy, I want to understand that. Let's talk about it. Melissa looked at me as if I'd said something out of the ordinary. To talk? Do you want to talk when you forbid Mom to even leave the house just to get some air? Her voice was getting louder, as if every word raised a wave of irritation. Michael interrupted her, his voice low but firm. We're just trying to protect her. We didn't forbid her anything. It's just that after what happened with the money, we were careful. Careful? Melissa asked sarcastically. Do you know what she said to me at lunch? She feels like she's in prison here. She's afraid to talk, afraid to do something, because you, Hannah, might get angry. Those words were a knife to the heart. I looked at my mother-in-law, hoping to hear that it was just a mistake, that she had never said such a thing. But her face remained stony, and her gaze avoided mine. Mom, is this true? Michael moved closer to his mother, peering into her face. Do you really think so? She finally spoke, her voice weak but clear. I just said that sometimes I don't have enough freedom. This is not an accusation. Hannah, Michael, you really care about me, and I appreciate it. But... She hesitated, then added quietly, I do feel a little depressed. These words shocked me. Everything I did seemed to be falling apart. We sincerely tried to create comfort and safety for her, and now all this was perceived as control and restriction. Melissa, seeing my confused look, added fuel to the fire. You see, Mom said it herself. Do you want to know what I want, Hannah? I want you to leave my mother alone. Give her the opportunity to live the way she wants. Melissa, stop it. Michael took his sister's hand. You don't know what we've been through these months. Hannah doesn't deserve such accusations. But I knew Melissa's words had already sowed doubt. My mother-in-law seemed to be at a crossroads, her gaze darting between us. If you feel unhappy here, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice even, I want you to know that no one is holding you back. We have always wanted only one thing, for you to be happy and protected." There was silence in the room. It seemed that all the words had been said, but the tension only grew. Whatever was behind Melissa's visit, I felt like it was just the beginning of something bigger. Her face clouded over, as if the sun had hidden behind gray clouds. My mother-in-law looked at me for a long time, as if she was going to say something that was long overdue in her heart. Finally, she turned to me with unexpected directness. "If you had left, I would have been able to relax and spend more pleasant time with Michael and Melissa." These words, spoken coldly like an autumn wind, took me by surprise. I felt something inside me crumble. All my efforts, all my care, all the sacrifices, all of this suddenly turned out to be unnecessary, even burdensome for her. I fell silent, although thoughts were spinning in my head. They didn't even know that I had previously paid off her debts, spending a significant portion of our savings to ease her financial situation. Perhaps I made a mistake that I did not do it transparently, did not explain that the money was taken from the family budget and not from my personal savings. But now the explanation seemed pointless. I looked at Michael. His face was frozen in an expression of anger. His hands were tightly clenched into fists, his shoulders were tense, and his body was trembling slightly with emotion. He seemed to be trying his best to keep his composure. Melissa stepped forward, her voice firm and even cheeky. "Mom and I are going to live here together now. That's why I want you to leave, Hannah." Her words echoed in the room. She said it with such defiance that the air seemed to freeze. I took a deep breath to keep the resentment from escaping. "I understand," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "But I will not interfere with what happens next." After that conversation, Michael and I decided to leave home. That day, when we packed up and prepared to leave, their reaction was unexpected. There was surprise on the faces of my mother-in-law and Melissa, but not so much from our decision as from what was behind it. "It looks like you've agreed to leave after all," Melissa remarked with a touch of malice. "Yes," Michael replied with a cold grin. "But before that, I would like to discuss something." He slowly walked over to the table, pulled out the documents from the folder and put them in front of Melissa. "What is it?" "What is it?" she asked, looking at the papers with interest. "I've decided that since I'm getting older, I should put the house in your name," Michael said with exaggerated seriousness. Melissa's eyes lit up. She couldn't hide her delight and exclaimed, "Really? Will this be my home?" Michael nodded. "Yes," he said. "All you need to do is sign here." Without hesitation, she grabbed a pen and, full of happiness, signed the documents. She was overflowing with joy. She was almost jumping up and down with delight. "I can't believe I have my own apartment now," she exclaimed, looking at the papers. Michael and I exchanged furtive glances and barely noticeable smiles. Our plan was successful. We had prepared all the documents in advance to divide the property, and now that the house was officially rewritten in Melissa's name, we had no obligations left to them. "Well," Michael said, "it's time to start preparing for our departure." The mother-in-law, finally realizing what was happening, turned to her son. "Michael, are you really leaving?" He nodded affirmatively. "Yes. I decided to leave too." "Even you're leaving?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with surprise. "Yes, Mom. If I'm not with Hannah, I don't feel comfortable either." "It's normal for married couples to be together," he said calmly but firmly. These words sounded the final chord, leaving the room in silence, filled with their realization that everything was really changing. Michael and I watched Melissa and my mother-in-law's faces as the movers took things out of the house. Their surprise was so obvious that I had to stifle a chuckle. Melissa looked especially confused when she noticed that household items that she considered her own were disappearing along with the furniture. "What are you doing? Are you going to take everything?" Her voice sounded harsh, almost hysterical. Of course, Michael replied calmly. We bought all this, and now we will need it in our new home. Melissa stood motionless, as if trying to comprehend what was happening. Her face turned purple when she finally said, But I'll need to buy everything new. You didn't even give me a chance to prepare. That's right, Michael said, smiling, and I hope you'll take that into account in the future. Michael and I left the house, leaving them standing in a daze. Soon Michael's phone rang, and of course it was Melissa. Her voice sounded strained. Hey, Michael, wait a minute. What did you mean when you talked about renting? The house is registered to me, right? Michael laughed softly. Actually, no. The house has been rented all this time. The document you signed is a lease agreement. Now, as a tenant, you have to pay the rent. There was silence on the other end of the line, and then her agitated voice rang out. Are you serious? I thought I had become the owner of the house. I'm sorry, Melissa, but no. This was our home, and it never belonged to you. Now that we've moved out, you'll have to pay the rent yourself. But my salary. She began, but Michael interrupted her. Don't worry. Hannah earns more than me, so you definitely have someone to take an example from. Listening to this, I couldn't help but smile. Melissa paused, apparently digesting what she had heard. Her defeat was almost palpable. But the most unexpected thing was that a few minutes later his mother called Michael's phone. Her voice sounded apologetic. Michael, I'm really sorry. We're both very sorry. Could you change your mind and come back? Michael sighed, and there was a firm but sad note in his voice. Thank you, Mom, but it will be difficult to return. Your attitude towards Hannah leaves me no other choice. She's the most important thing to me. I hope you can take care of yourself. After that conversation, Michael and I finally severed all ties with this house. There were rumors from neighbors that Melissa and her mother-in-law, having lost their former comfort, ended up in a small rented apartment, where they constantly argued over money. Their new position obviously did not meet their expectations, and even the neighbors looked at them with undisguised disapproval. Michael and I started a new, peaceful life in a cozy house that was now ours alone. Every day was filled with warmth and happiness. We laughed, cooked dinners together, and discussed plans for the future. Everything that seemed so complicated and confusing in the past has now receded, leaving us to enjoy the well-deserved peace.